Welcome to Chapter 8. This chapter will focus on the Mexican Americans and their experience in the U.S. As most of us very likely already know, people of Spanish, Mexican, and American Indian ancestry were here for some time before Anglo-Americans. Much like the Native Americans, Mexican Americans eventually became a conquered minority after the Mexican-American War in 1846. Since the Mexican American technically didn't come to America of their own free will like other immigrants, we had to assume that the three-generation assimilation scenario doesn't apply. While some might doubt that immigrant minorities actually follow the three-generation process of assimilation, the colonial model takes a different path where resistance to assimilation is often prevalent. The colonized minorities in America were indigenous to the areas where they had the new culture imposed on them. It was a bit different with African Americans since their movement was restricted and their ability to compete with the dominant group was limited. Blauner found some commonalities between the African American and the Mexican Americans in terms of their social and economic situations. Both groups were seen as a cheap source of labor and relegated to the bottom of the occupational ladder. The Mexican Americans that were here were a part of a larger group that was bound by a common heritage of varied indigenous backgrounds. Alvarez referred to them as the creation generation. When the Spanish came to Mexico in the early 16th century, they quickly began to expand their dominion into a large territory. While the Spanish monarchy was more interested in material gain and land, the Catholic Church was interested in Christianizing the natives. While the Indians were viewed as a labor source and were relegated to slave-like conditions, they were still regarded as humans worthy of a place in the Mexican society. The assimilation of the Indians in Mexico was faster than in the U.S. As the U.S. acquired more territory and boundaries became vague, tensions rose between the two neighbors. In 1819, a treaty was struck between Mexico and the U.S., which settled some of the territorial disputes. Florida went to the United States while Texas remained with Mexico. 15 years after Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, Texas broke free of Mexico and formed an independent republic. All of this happened amid the many frontier changes brought on by manifest destiny and numerous territorial disputes with Mexico. The Texas Republic and the U.S. maintained a strong policy of immigrant cooperation. It was disputes over the looming American annexation of Texas that finally led to the declaration of war in 1846. 2 years later, Mexico surrendered and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed by both nations. Mexico surrendered nearly one-half of its territory to the U.S., and the Rio Grande became the boundary between Texas and Mexico. The treaty granted U.S. citizenship to those who chose to stay in the territory, but their rights were generally ignored, and they were looked upon as conquered and inferior people. The Mexican Americans had not chosen to leave their land to come to the U.S. Their homes, however, were no longer part of Mexico. The Mexican American population became a subordinate minority with less power and found themselves having to compete for the available resources. As lynchings and beatings took place along the Texas border, Juan Cortina organized a series of raids that came to be known as the Cortina Wars. In the meantime, American recognition of the Diaz regime in Mexico sparked anger along the borderlands. Pancho Villa began attacking Americans, and his attack on Columbus, New Mexico, spurred an aggressive response by the U.S., led by General John J. Pershing, which did little to improve relations between the two countries. With all of the background now told, our authors now lead us through the assimilation process of the Mexican American population. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, few Mexicans came to the United States. We need to look at the assimilation of Mexican Americans as it occurred during the second immigrant stream from Europe. Restriction of immigration into the U.S. began in 1882 with a focus on Asian immigrants. The open door was beginning to close a bit. The growing economy and the need for labor in the Southwest created opportunities for Mexican immigrants starting in 1904. Mexican immigrants entering the country after 1900 became the new first generation of Mexican immigrants. Scarcely enough time has elapsed to test the three-generation hypothesis for this group. Alvarez proposes that Mexican Americans are closest to being migrants rather than immigrants, since they crossed the border to a territory that was previously theirs rather than arrive from a different continent like other immigrants. As they arrived, they tended to gravitate toward each other, establishing their barrios. They were not distinguished from the Mexicans who were already there. The negative history between the Mexicans and the Anglo-Americans set the stage for unrest. The Mexicans occupied the borderlands first and were forced to surrender it after the annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War. Most immigrant minorities didn't experience the tensions that the Mexican Americans did in the borderlands. A great majority of the group, the migrant generation, has been here only since the 1900s. Still, there has been little change among the Mexican Americans in the many years that assimilation has had its chance to impact and influence them. Our authors now turn to the topic of Native reaction to Mexican immigration. Exploitation by American employers was common, as they hired them at low wages and provided housing at high rates. Sanitation conditions in the workplace were poor, and children were put to work in unsafe conditions. Many Mexicans came across the border in response to the demand for labor and agriculture. The influx slowed in the 1920s when permanent visas became more difficult to acquire. The advent of the Great Depression saw the deportation of Mexican aliens, while Mexican Americans felt the threat of possible repatriation. Mexican Americans felt the cold shoulder that Anglo-Americans often showed immigrant groups during difficult economic times. The Bracero program brought millions of guest workers to the U.S. on a temporary basis beginning in August of 1942. This set the stage for the regulation and movement of temporary workers and the mess we have today. At this time, undocumented workers became a convenient alternative since they would work for less. The steady influx of Mexican immigration strengthened the culture and preserved the Spanish language in the U.S. But American prejudice increased as the numbers of Mexicans rose. The presence of a reserve labor force kept wages low and created issues for labor unions, while the Mexican government protested the discrimination Mexican citizens endured in the U.S. In June of 1943, the Zoot Suit riots broke out as a result of the Sleepy Lagoon trial, where several Mexican-American youths were convicted for a mysterious death that occurred after a gang fight in East LA. The prosecution focused on the appearance of the defendants, who wore zoot suits and cultivated the pachuco look. The convictions were overturned by the appeals courts and rioting ensued. Off-duty policemen and U.S. servicemen attacked Mexican Americans sporting the pachuco attire. Rather than turn on the American culture, the Mexican Americans sought to prove their loyalty. The cold reception they received as they returned as veterans from World War II and the continued discrimination in the 1960s prompted their own civil rights movement. In 1929, LULAC was formed, with its platform of assimilation and ending discrimination. Other organizations formed as well, with agendas that were more political in nature. The work of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and their formation of the United Farm Workers Union brought national attention to the issues and discrimination faced by Mexican Americans. MALDEF and LULAC also launched legal attacks against segregation of Mexican American students in schools. The push for cultural nationalism for Mexican Americans relaxed as Chicano activists have moved into the middle class. Mexican Americans still struggled for continued structural assimilation, while the proximity to Mexico has resulted in a mixed identity, while their loyalty to the U.S. remains strong.